Okay, so now we reached a good synthesis quality. So now we can compare the single phase synthesis approach with the more general multiple phase synthesis approach. And from this experiment, it appeared that when we asked the test subjects to rate the audiovisual speech quality, they really preferred the samples that were generated using our single phase synthesis approach. So this proved again it's really necessary to have this maximal level of audiovisual coherence in the output speech. Now the final part of the research was about speech labels for visual speech synthesis. So visual text-to-speech synthesis is the problem of going from text input to a visual-only speech signal. Now, why would you need something like this? Well, imagine you have text information and you record an original speaker uttering the text. So you get original acoustic speech. Then you can give the timings of this original acoustic speech and this text information as input to such a visual speech synthesizer. And then this system can generate a synthetic visual speech. And then you can generate high quality audiovisual speech by just joining this original acoustic speech with the synthetic visual speech. And achieving audiovisual speech this way saves you time and saves you money, because to record only acoustic speech is much more cheap and much more easy than to record audiovisual speech, because then you need a camera and a studio and lighting and a background and so on. Now when you synthesize visual speech, an important concept is a viseme. And a viseme, this is a visual representation of a phoneme. I give you an example. For instance, the phoneme m can be represented by a closed mouth. The phoneme o can be represented by a mouth that shows a lot of lip rounding. And I also show here examples for the s and the a. Now, how do I go from phoneme labels to viseme labels? Well, the standard approach for this is to use a minute-to-one mapping from phonemes to visemes. For instance, the p, b, and m phoneme, they all look the same. It's always a closed mouth, so you can cluster them into, let's say, viseme 1. The same can be said about phonemes s and z. You can cluster them in viseme 2. And so on for the F, the V, and the W, and so on and so on. And this defines a minute-to-one mapping from phonemes to visemes. So, for instance, the Dutch text mep can be described by phonemes m, e, p, but also by visemes using this phoneme-to-viseme mapping. So, the visual representation of the text mep can be described by viseme 1, viseme 4, viseme 1. Now, there's a problem with this minute-to-one mapping, because what about visual coarticulation? And visual coarticulation means that the visual appearance of a particular instance of a phoneme depends on the properties of the neighboring phonemes in the sentence. I give you an example. Imagine the aspect lip rounding, and then imagine the uttering of the English words school and boots. Now, to utter the oo sound, you really need this lip rounding. But when you utter school, you already see lip rounding before the oo sound has started. And the other way around, when you utter boots, there is still some lip rounding after the oo sound has been uttered. And this is called coarticulation. For instance, in the school, when the visual representation of the K phoneme will show a lot of lip rounding. But this is not true for other instances of the K phoneme in other words. So the K phoneme here is affected by coarticulation. Now, due to this visual coarticulation, we have this behavior. Phoneme 1 can appear such as viseme 1, or it can appear such as viseme 3, depending on its context. The same can be said for viseme 2 and for viseme 3 and so on. So at the end, we have a many-to-many mapping from phonemes to visemes, because every phoneme can be mapped onto different visemes based on its context. And also the other way around, to end up in a certain viseme, you can start from different phonemes. Now, by analyzing our Dutch database, our Dutch audiovisual speech database using decision trees and k-means clustering, we were able to map the 49 Dutch phonemes onto 11, 20, and 50 of such minute-to-many viseme labels. And now we evaluated these viseme labels, and it seemed that these minute-to-many visemes perform much better in describing the visual speech information compared to phoneme-based speech labels and compared to speech labels based on minute-to-one visemes. So it was very interesting to see how these minute-to-many visemes behave when you use them for visual speech synthesis. And these are two syntheses I made with this system. So I will show you original acoustic speech and synthesized visual speech. And to create these samples, I used a minute-to-many visemes to label the target speech and to label the speech from the database. And to create the left sample, I provided a complete database of 1,700 sentences to the synthesizer. And to generate the second sample, I only provided the synthesizer with 33 samples.
Haar succes dankt de uitgifte zowel aan de timing als aan de erg gunstige voorwaarden. En dat ondanks de op zijn minst verwarde politieke en economische toestand in Rusland. Haar succes dankt de uitgifte zowel aan de timing als aan de erg gunstige voorwaarden. En dat ondanks de op zijn minst verwarde politieke en economische toestand in Rusland.
Now, if you watch carefully, you would have seen that in the first sample, indeed, the displayed speech gestures are of better quality. But nevertheless, I think if you compare the difference in quality between these two samples and the difference in the amount of data that is needed to generate them, I think this is still an interesting result. And one of the reasons why we are able to synthesize this rather high quality synthetic visual speech using only 33, so only a very, very small database, is the fact that the target speech and the speech we select from the database is described using these minute-to-many viseme labels, so we take this visual co-articulation effect into account. Okay, finally, some general conclusions. When you perform audiovisual speech synthesis, we found that for a high-quality audiovisual speech synthesis, a maximal level of audiovisual coherence is needed to ensure that the individual quality of the synthetic auditory speech and the individual quality of the synthetic visual speech mode is not affected when these two speech modes are displayed audiovisually to an observer. And to attain such a maximal level of audiovisual coherence, a single-phase synthesis approach is preferable. Now, I implemented a single-phase synthesis approach in my thesis in a concatenative synthesizer, but there also exist other speech synthesis approaches, and I think it's very interesting to us to see how these could be implemented in a single-phase approach as well. And more in general, I think that future research in the field of visual speech synthesis should focus more on the multimodality of the problem and not only on the unimodal individual optimization of the synthetic speech. And then when you perform visual speech synthesis, I think some serious questions can be raised on the standard use of minute-to-one phoneme-to-viseme mappings, because we showed that context-dependent minute-to-many visemes perform much better in describing the visual speech information. And when you apply these visemes for visual speech synthesis, we showed that you can attain a rather high synthesis quality using only a limited database. But also for other purposes, these minute-to-many viseme labels are promising. For instance, they can improve the quality of visual speech analysis, for instance, in an application for audiovisual speech recognition.
Hiermee zijn we op het einde van de presentatie. Bedankt voor uw aandacht. Vanaf nu beantwoordt Wesley graag uw vragen. Misschien ziet u mij later nog eens terug, zoals op de aankondigingen op het vliegveld of misschien zelfs op uw draagbare telefoon.
So as the lady says, we have come to the end of this presentation. I thank you for your attention and I will be happy to answer your questions.